On that note, let's get started with the next topic for today's session, that is, what is REST API? Now, since the invention of the internet, we have been using different applications and web pages to get data from various resources. However, have you ever thought, where does this data come from? Well, it's servers from where we get the data, and I know by this time of the session, you have an idea about the servers. Well, what do you think REST API is? But before I tell you what is REST API, let me take you through an example to make you understand the need of REST API. So if I have to explain you the need of REST API, then you can consider the scenario that you can see on my screen. Now, I'm sure all of us use it on a daily basis or on a regular basis. So this application basically needs a lot of input data, as in the data present in the application is never static. For example, let's say there's a specific movie present in Book My Show app. And maybe after 2 months, maybe the movie is running nowhere in any theater, so the movie has to be removed, right? So the movie has to be removed from the Book My Show app also. So by that's what I mean by when I say static. Either the movie is getting released on a frequent basis, or various cities showing different languages movies at various times of the day. The data keeps changing on a day-to-day basis, or even you can say the data keeps changing on a second basis. So it's never static. That means that data is always changing. Now, where do you think we get this data from? I'm sure by now you have understood that there's a lot of data present, and then we get a lot of input data for this particular application. But what do you think? Where do you think we get this data from? Well, this data is received from the server, or most commonly known as a web server. So obviously we receive the data from the server. So when the client sends the request to the server for the required information via an API, the server then sends a response to the client. Over here, the response sent to the client is in the form of an HTML web page. But do you think it is an app response that you would expect when you send a request? Well, I'm assuming by the fact that you would say no. This is because since anybody of us would prefer the data to be returned in the form of a structured format rather than the complete web page. So for such reasons, the data returned by the server in response to the request of the client is either in the form of a JSON format or the XML format. Now, both these formats, the JSON format and the XML format, have a proper hierarchical structure of the data. This sounds quite simple, right? But the only issue which is present in this framework till now is that you have to use a lot of methods to get the required information. To the fact, using these methods to retrieve information becomes quite cumbersome when you require complex data. So this is where REST API comes into the picture. The REST API creates an object and thereafter sends the values of an object in response to the client. So now that you know the need of REST API, let's take a look at what is REST API. Now, REST suggests to create an object of the data requested by the client and sends the values of the object in response to the user. For example, if the user is requesting for a movie in Bangalore at a certain place and certain time, then you can create an object on the server side. So over here, you have an object and then you're sending the state of an object, right? So that is why REST is known as representational state transfer, guys. So if I have to define REST or representational state transfer for you, then it is an architectural style as well as an approach for communications purposes that is often used in various web services development. The architectural style of REST helps in leveraging the lesser use of bandwidth to make an application more suitable in the internet. Now, it is often regarded as the language of the internet and is completely based on the resources. Now, to understand better, let's dive a little bit deeper into how exactly a REST API works. Basically, the REST API breaks down the transaction in order to create smaller modules. Now, each of these modules is used to address a specific part of the transaction, and this approach provides more flexibility but requires a lot of effort to be built from the very scratch. So now that you know what is REST API and the need of it, let me take you through the features of REST API. So the features of REST API are, as you can see on my screen, it's simpler than the SOAP protocol, it has clear documentation, and provides good messages. When I say good error messages, the user or the developer can easily understand where is the error and then what is the problem that has to be debugged. So guys, that was about the features of REST API. So now that you know what is REST API and what is the need of it, let us next understand the constraints or principles which must be satisfied for an application to be regarded as a REST API. Well, there are 6 ground principles laid by Dr. Fielding, who was the one to define the REST API design in 2000. The 6 ground principles are stateless, client-server, uniform interface, cacheable, layered system, and code on demand. So talking about stateless first, the request sent from the client to a server will contain all the required information to make the server understand the request from the client. So basically, this can be either a part of the URL, the query string parameters, body, or even headers. The URL is used to uniquely identify the resource and the body holds the state of requesting resource. Now, once the server processes the request, a response is sent to the client through the body, status, or headers. Coming to client server, the client server architecture enables a uniform interface and separates clients from the servers. This enhances the portability across multiple platforms as well as the scalability of server components. Coming to the next one, that is uniform interface. To obtain the uniformity throughout the application, REST has four interface constraints, that is the resource identification, the resource manipulation using representations, self-descriptive messages, and hypermedia as the engine of application state. Moving on to the next principle, that is cacheable. In order to provide better performance, the applications are often made cacheable. This is done by labeling the response from the server as cacheable and non-cacheable either implicitly or explicitly. If the response is defined as cacheable, then the client data can reuse the response data for equivalent responses in the future. Moving on to the next one, that is layered system. The layered system architecture allows an application to be more stable by limiting the component behavior. Now, this type of architecture helps in enhancing the application security as the components in each layer cannot interact beyond the next intermediate layer they are in. So it basically enables load balancing and provides shared caches for promoting scalability. Moving on to the last principle, that is code on demand. This is an optional constraint and is used the least. It basically permits a client's code or applets to be downloaded and to be used within the application. In essence, it simplifies the clients by creating a smart application which doesn't rely on its own code structure. So I hope that you've understood the principles of REST API. So now let's look into the methods of REST API. Now, all of us working with the technology of web do CRUD operations, right? So when I say CRUD operations, I mean that we create a resource, we read a resource, we update a resource, and we delete a resource. Now, to do these actions, you can actually use the HTTP methods, which are nothing but the REST API methods. So if you can see on my screen, to create a resource, we use the post method. To read a resource, we use the get method. To update a resource, we use the put method. And to delete a resource, we use a delete method. So guys, these are the various methods of REST API, and all these methods are the HTTP methods. So I hope that you've understood what is REST API and what are the methods of it. So let's get started with the hands-on part of using REST services in Spring Boot. Now over here, why do you think we need REST services? Well, I spoke about the same in the theory part, but if you look into the practical part of it, if you consider this particular URL, let's say get details, and then let's say, we want to get details for the first customer. In general, if you pass the request, you'll pass like a question mark, and then you'll mention the customer name, and then you'll mention Sahiti, right? So C name will be in lower caps. But in a scenario where you just want to find the customer details, like let's say, /1, because my customer ID was 1, right, for Sahiti. So if I just want to retrieve the details of the customer Sahiti and I want to retrieve with the help of customer ID, then how will I do it? And how will I make sure that, the URL is clean, and also, we have specific URLs for different kinds of stuff, right? So how do you think we can get started with it? So initially what I'm going to do is I'm going to just change this particular repository to the JPA repository. Well, you can ask me why am I changing it to JPA repository? It's just that, I'm just using the interface of JPA repository, right? So I'll just change it to jpa repository.org, and then I'll just import the required library, right? And after that, what I'll do is I'll just come back to the form controller file. Now in the form controller file, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create different methods, and then I'm going to use different request mappings, that is basically different URLs to retrieve the details. So let's get started. So initially, let's say you want to find all the customers present in the database, right? So for that, you'll just use a URL, let's say customers. So for that, I'll just use the mapping, request mapping, and in the brackets, I'll mention /customers, right? And then I'll just create a method, let's say public string, let's say get customers. And in this particular method, what I'm going to do is I'm going to return all the customers present in the database. So to return all the customers present in the database, what you have to do is you have to type in return repo dot find all, right? So I'm just going to find all of them. And then when we return all the customers, it will be in iterable format. So we have to convert it to string, right? So I'll just convert it to string. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to execute this particular code. But before that, let me just collect a few insert statements. So I'll just go back to the H2 console and I'll just mention insert into values. But before that, I have to mention the table's name. And then what I'll do is I'll mention one, let's say sahiti@edureka.co. Let's say I mention the name Sahiti. After that, similarly, let's type in other insert statements. Let's say insert to, I'll change to Sanjana. And over here also, I'll change it to Sanjana. And again, in the third statement, let's say insert 3, I'll change it to, let's say, Veena. And over here also, I'll change it to Veena. Now what I'll do is I'll just copy the statements and keep it with myself. So now before I execute this particular project, let me just tell you that, I'm just using the request mapping customers annotation to directly just get all the customers from the H2 database and then display their output in the customers page. So I'll just execute this particular project. Right, so you can see Tomcat has started on port number 8084. Now what I'm going to do is I'll just go to Edureka customers. You can see that we can start from the very scratch where we enter the customer details or not. So for you, what I'll do is I'll just enter customer details. Let's say customer name is Jagannath, and then I mention edureka.co, right? Then I click on submit. Now what I'll do is I'll open the H2 console, right? And then I'll just refresh the H2 console. I'll just connect, right? And then I'll just insert these statements. Okay, it says primary key violation. So let's just check what are the values present. So I'll just select star from customers. So the data has been already inserted. So we get the output that, we have 4 customers with Sahiti, Sanjana, Veena, and Jagannath as their customer names, right? Now what I'm going to do over here is basically that, I'm going to go and open another web page that is basically localhost colon 8084 slash customers. Now, when I load this web page, we see an output that, localhost colon 8084 slash customers, we see basically an error where we do not have any response, right? So that is because, we have missed a response body annotation over here. All right, so we'll import the @ response body annotation. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to relaunch the project and let's just wait for it to happen. But before that, let me just copy this. All right, so we can see that, our application has started. Now what I'm going to do is I'll just mention the customer details. Let's say for customer name, let's say Jagannath, and then email address to be jagannath@edureka.co. Right. And now what I'll do is I'll go to my H2 console. I'll refresh, I'll connect, and I'll just do select staff from customers. Right. And I'll run. So you can see that, I have one particular query. Now I'm just going to insert these particular queries, right? So you can see that, all these queries are inserted. So now I'll just select staff from customers. And then we can see an output that, we have 4 customers with the IDs 1, 2, 3, 4. Now what we're going to do over here is basically we'll go to localhost colon 8084 slash customers, and then we can see an output of, customer ID 1 with their email address, name, and this customer ID. Similarly, we've got all the details of all the other customers also. In a scenario where you want to retrieve data of only a specific customer, let's say, you want to retrieve data of the second customer, how do you think that you can do? Well, it's really simple. What you have to do is you just have to copy this particular part, paste it over here, and then let's say we change the URL to 2. And in get customers also, what I'm going to do is I'll just mention get customers 2. And then what I'll do is I'll just change this method over here. So repo to find by ID, right? So we're just trying to find by ID, right? So I'll just mention find by ID and we'll mention 2 over here, right? And then I'll click on save. Let me just execute this project, right? So let me just go to forms and then I'll right click over here. I'll choose run as, and then I'll go to Spring Boot app, right? So let's just execute this particular project. Right, so as you can see, the project has been started on port number 8084. Right, so now what I'll do is I'll go back to my localhost port number 8084. Let's say I enter few details, right, and I'll just enter. Right, now once this is done, since we want to retrieve only the customer for 2, so what I'll do is I'll just mention localhost colon 8084 slash customers. And when you mention slash customers, you see all the details of all the customers present. Now, since we want to retrieve the details of only the second customer, what I'll do is I'll just copy this particular URL over here and I'll mention /2. Once I mention /2, you can see that, we have customer ID 2, customer name Sanjana, and then email address to be sanjana@edureka.co. Similarly, if I put 3, you can see that, it's not working. Now what happens over here is that, we have configured the method only for customer 2, right? But in general, if you want to configure the method for, let's say, all the customers, let's say, all the customers who are present in the database, we want to configure for all of them. Let's say, even if I type customer/1, we should retrieve the details of the first customer. Even if I type customer/2, then I should retrieve the details of the second customer, and so on, right? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the request mapping over here. So over here, I'll mention CID, right? And then in get customers, what I'll do is I'll just mention, let's say, let it be get customers 2 only. I'll just mention CID over here. And then over here also, I'll just change it to CID, right? I hope that's clear to you. So basically what I've done over here is basically that, I've just changed the URL to customers and then CID. So whatever customer ID is passed by the user, that particular customer details must be displayed as output. But the only problem here is that, we haven't told Spring it has to take from the parameters that has been passed in the URL, right? So for that, what we'll do is we'll basically use the @path variable annotation, right? So I'll just mention the path variable annotation. I'll just import the required libraries. And then what I'll do is I'll just mention in bracket that it should be CID. So whatever is passed in CID, that has to be taken into account, right? So now let's just execute this particular query again, right? So I'll just relaunch this particular application. Right now, once the application is relaunched, let's just, I'll mention 1 Sahiti and then sahiti@edureka.co, then 2 customer name Sanjana, and 3 Jagannath and Jagannath@edureka.co. Now I'll just reload this particular page, and then we see that, the output stands the same. Now let's say we want to retrieve the details of the customer 3, right? So I'll just put this URL, and then you can see that, we automatically got the details of the third customer. Now similarly, let's say we want to retrieve for the first customers, we just have to change the number in the URL, and automatically we see that, the output is generated. So guys, that's how you can use a simple object, and then you can pass the request. Now let's say, you want to get a list of customers, right? Now, for example, over here, if you observe in the methods, I was using the string method. So I was basically returning a string. Now let's say if you want to get the list method. So for that, initially itself, what I'd done was I'd changed the CRUD repository to the JPA repository. Now I changed that because, the JPA repository extends the page sorting repository and also the CRUD repository itself, right? So we have all the methods all together, right? So if I just double click on over here, so now coming back to the controller, what we can basically do is that, if you want to see a list is returned. So for that, what I'll do is I'll just remove this part of string, and I'll say list, and over here, I'll say customers, right? And then I'll mention repo to find all, and then I will not convert it to string, right? So this will basically return an iterable that is basically a list. Now similarly, if you want to change over here, what we can simply do is that, if we do not want to retrieve a string, but yet if you want to retrieve any, let's say, optional character, let's say if you want to retrieve a specific detail of the customer, we have to use the optional class, and then inside that we have to mention customers. Right over here, I'll just remove the string part, and then what I'll do is I'll just click on save. All right, I think I've missed something. I think there's a bracket that is missing. Yeah. So what I've done over here is basically change the string method to a list method. So basically we're trying to retrieve the data in form of a JSON format. So we can go forward and do that. So if I just relaunch this particular application, let's see what happens. So let's just wait for it to load. All right, the application has started on port number 8084. So I'll just mention few details. Let's say 1 Sahiti and Sahiti@edureka.co. Let's say 2 Anjana, and then Sanjana@edureka.co. Now what I'll do is I'll just mention localhost 8084/customers, and then you see a change in the output. That means the output is in the form of a JSON format. So that's how basically you can go with the optional class and also with the list of data values, right? So for example, if I want to retrieve the data of the single customer, initially the output was in the string format, but if I reload, you'll see that, the output is in the form of a JSON format, right? So guys, that's how basically you can play around with REST services. But yet, if you want to play around more with REST services, I would suggest that, you should go forward and use the Postman client. So without any further ado, let me just open the Postman client and show you how that looks. Right, so installing Postman is really simple, guys. You just have to go to their official website and then install Postman, and then automatically you'll see that, the Postman gets configured for your system. It's just a matter of few minutes that, Postman takes to install. Now you might be wondering, why am I stressing so much on Postman? Well, I'm stressing so much on Postman because it's like a GUI. So whatever we were seeing on our web pages, you can see directly on Postman, maybe in a better format also, right? So you can see it's a similar outputs in a better format with more color coordination and maybe in different formats like XML, JSON format and other web pages, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the get method over here and I'm going to use it on 8084 and then I'll mention customers and then I click on send. Now, when I click on send, you'll automatically see that, there are two customer IDs present. That is the customer one and customer two, right? So that was what we had mentioned before also. Now, let's say, you want it in an XML format. You can very well go and change it over here. And then you see that, automatically the output is in XML format. And automatically, if you say auto, then it will automatically come in the form of a JSON format. All right, let's say, you want to retrieve the details of a single customer. You can go forward and just mention the URL to be one. And then you see the output of only a single customer, right? Now, this is not the only method which can be used with Postman. Well, you can go forward and use the put, post, patch, delete, and so on methods, right? But don't worry, we're going to look into each one of them one by one. So for now, let's get started with post mapping. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy paste this particular part and then I'll put it over here. Let's say we add post mapping. So post mapping is basically used to create a new customer. If you remember in the CRUD operations, I said you create a resource. So for that, you use the post method. You read a resource, for that you use the get method. To you update a resource, for that you use the put method, and to delete a resource you use the delete method. So I'm going to use the post method over here. So for that I'll mention the post mapping annotation and then I'll mention /customers in the URL. I'll just remove the response body annotation because we do not want anything, and over here what I'll do is I'll just add customers and let's say the get customers, let's say 3, that is basically a method name, and in the brackets I'll mention request body, and over here again we'll mention the customers class and customers, right? So basically I'm requesting from the body itself, right? And over here what I'm trying to do is I'll basically save the new customers into the repository, right? So for that I'll mention repo dot save, and over here we'll mention customers, right? And then again we have to return something, so for that we'll return customers. Right, so I hope this part is clear. So now let's just execute the same. So when I just relaunch this particular application, all right, so you can see that Tomcat has started on port number 8084. So what I'll do is I won't go to the web browser now. I'll go to the Postman, and then what I'll do is I'll just type in get localhost 8084 customers. So over here you'll see that the data is null because there's nothing present. So now when we go back to our web page and let's say we add data, right? So I'll just mention a record of 2. Now, once the details are mentioned, let's just send the request again of get, and we'll see that, the output is updated and automatically the details of both the customers are displayed. Now, since we're using the post method, what we basically want to do is we want to create a new resource, right? So for that, we'll go to the body section, right? And I'll just remove this part, right? And then I'll just copy paste this part over here. I'll mention 3. Let's say I mention Veena, and over here also I mention Veena, right? And over here I mention post, right? And now once this is done, I'll just click on send, and when I click on send, you'll automatically see the output. It says that pages customers.jsp is not found. So let me just zoom in a little bit before I move forward, right? So I'll just zoom in a little bit so that it's clear to your eyes, right? So over here you can clearly see that when I go to get and then I mention localhost 884/customers, we get the third detail also, that is customer 3, that is Veena, and veena@eureka.co. So guys, that's how basically you can use the post method also. Now similarly, let's see how we can delete a record, right? Now to delete a method, what we basically have to do is we have to mention the customer ID, right? So for example, let's say we want to delete the third record, then we have to mention the customer ID of the third customer, right? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy paste this particular section, right? And over here I'll just change the mapping to delete mapping, right? And then I'll just import the required package, and over here I'll just change the URL to customer ID. Okay, I'm sorry, this has to be in lowercase, right? And then what I'll do is I'll just change the method name to customers 4, and then what I'll do is in the path variables over here I'll just remove this particular section, and then I'll mention the @path variable annotation because we want to check the customer ID present in the URL, right? So we'll mention @path variable in CID, and then in brackets over here I'll mention CID. Now once that is done, what I'll do is I'll basically get 1. So basically what happens is that once you delete the data from the record, you have to delete the row also, right? So for that, what I'll do is I'll just mention customers. Say cust is the object name, right? And then I'll mention repo dot get one. And over here, I'll mention the CID, right? So basically what I'm doing over here is that, I'm taking all the customer IDs from the repository, and then whatever is passed in the URL, whichever customer ID is passed in the URL, that particular customer ID's complete row must be deleted, right? So that's what I'm doing over here. And then what I'll do is I'll basically delete the row, right? So for that, I'll just mention repo.delete, and I'll mention cust, right? That is basically our entity that we have chosen over here. And then I'll just mention return cust, right? So I hope this part is clear, right? So I'll just execute this particular project again. All right, so you can see that, our application has started on port 8084. So similarly, what I'll do is I'll first go to our web page, and then I'll just enter few details. Right, so 3 details have been entered. Now I'll go back to my Postman, and then I'll choose get customers, and then you can automatically see the details of all the 3 customers. Now what I want to do is I want to delete, right? So I'll go to delete, right? And over here, what I'll do is I'll just mention the URL to delete. So let's say I want to delete the 3rd customer. So I'll just mention /3 and then choose the delete method and click on send. Now once we click on send, we automatically see that, we see a timestamp status of error not found. That means it is already deleted. So I go to get again over here, and then if I mention customers, you see that, we get an output of only 2 customers. That means automatically our customer 3 has got deleted when we had sent a request for delete. Now similar, if you want to check whether it is deleted in the database or not, what you can do is we can just log into our database. So I'll just log into our database, right? I'll just click on connect, and let's say I just mention select star from customers, run, and then you see only 2 records, that is 1 and 2, right? So that's how, guys, basically you can delete the specific record or a set of data from database. Now let's look into the last method, that is basically the put method. So the put method is basically used to update a resource, right? Now to update a resource, again, you have to do the same thing. Let's say, you want to update the details of the first customer. So to do that, what you'll do is you'll basically create a new method, right? So I'll just copy paste this particular section, and then I'll change, right? So I'll just change it to put mapping, and then I'll import the required libraries, right? After that, what I'll do is I'll have to basically change the path also. So the path will be basically customers, and then it should consume our application file, right? So over here, I'll just remove everything. I'll mention path equal to, and then in double quotes, I'll mention slash customers, and then I'll mention consumes equal to, and over here, I'll mention application.json file, right? So that's basically our application file. Sorry, my bad, it's not JSON, it should be slash, right? And then what I'll do is I'll just mention another method, let's say customers file. And over here, what I'll do is I'll have to change the parameters over here. So I'm just basically requesting something, right? So I'll mention @request body, right? And over here, I'll mention customers, right? And in this particular section, I'll just remove the customer ID over here, and I'll save our repository with the updated data, right? So for that, I'll mention repo.save, and over here in brackets, I'll mention customers, right? After that, I'll just return the customers, right? So I'll just mention return customers, right? So I hope this part is clear. Now, if you observe, the post mapping and the put mapping are almost similar on how we do the programming part, and the delete mapping and the get mapping are something very different. So what I'll do is I'll just relaunch this particular application again. So let's just relaunch, right? I'll click on OK. Right, so as you can see, the application has started on port number 8084. So I'll go back to my web page first, and then I'll just enter the customer ID and customer name for few details, right? So I'll just mention, let's say for 2 records. Now what I'll do is I'll go back to my Postman, and I'll do the get method. You see that, we have only 1 customer. So let me just enter for the second one also. I think there was an issue, right? And now I'll just send the request again. And then you see that, we have the details for 2 customers, right? Now we're trying to update the details of the first customer, right? So what I'll do is I'll copy this particular section, and then I'll change the URL to put. And now after that, what I'll do is I'll go to body, then I'll choose raw. I'll mention over here, right? And let's say I change Sanjana's name to Sanjana Murthy, and email also to Murthy, right? Now, when I send the request for the get method, you see that, nothing is updated. Now, initially, we were not getting the updated values because, our format was in text, but yet in your code, you had clearly mentioned that it would consume the JSON format, right? So in that scenario, what you have to do is you have to change to JSON over here, and then you can mention the updated values, and then you can go forward and use the put method. Now, once you use the put method and click on send, you'll see that, automatically the data will be updated. Right, so you go to get over here and choose customers, and when you choose customers, you see that the customer ID with customer ID 1 whose initial name was Sanjana has now changed to Sanjana Murthy, and email also whose email was sanjana@edureka.co has changed to Sanjana Murthy@edureka.co. So guys, that's how basically you can use the REST services or the REST API to manipulate data and to pass data from web application to database, and similarly from database to web application in Spring Boot. But before I close with this part of the session, I would just like to show you the H2 database with the updated data. Right, so what I'll do is I'll just copy this particular statement, run, and then I'll just connect again. Now once I connect again and click on run, you see that the email address and the name has been changed also in the database. So I hope that you've understood